Hello, everyone. Good afternoon. Can everybody hear me? Can we see like thumbs? Everybody's good. Can hear me speaking and everything. You don't have to turn your cameras on, of course. And I would actually ask in advance if you could mute yourselves. We will have a discussion Q&A session at the end of the panel. So if you could mute yourselves until then, that would be wonderful. So welcome and good afternoon. And thank you so much for joining me and this wonderful group of scholars who will be speaking for two panels today. So this event is split into two panels with a short break in between. The first one here is taking place from 3 until 4:20. Then we will take a 4-minute break and there will be a second panel that will take place from 4:30 to 6 p.m. I want to begin today by acknowledging that Rutgers University, where I teach, and Central New Jersey, where I currently am, stands on the ancestral lands of the Lenni Lenape people who have lived here for at least 10,000 years and are still here, both in New Jersey and among the Lenape diaspora, and constitute an inherently sovereign nation. We pay respect to Indigenous people throughout the Lenape diaspora, past, present, and future, and honor those who have been historically and systematically disenfranchised. We also acknowledge that Rutgers University, like New Jersey and the United States as a nation, was founded upon the exclusions and erasures of Indigenous people. My name is Professor Sylvia Chan-Malik, and I am an associate professor in the Departments of American Studies and Women's Gender and Sexuality Studies at Rutgers-New Brunswick, where I teach courses on race and ethnicity in the United States, social justice, and Islam and Muslims in the US. This event was spurred in part by my own research and teaching on these topics, but even more so by conversations with wonderful colleagues and friends, some of whom are here on these two panels today, over at least the last 2 decades, over and about the intersections of race and religion, and specifically Blackness and Islam in our scholarship and teaching, and for some of us, our advocacy, public service, and activism. As with everything we do, these conversations have not taken place in a vacuum, but against the political and social uprisings of the last 5 years, though of course these movements have much longer genealogies that emerge from histories of Black and Third World struggle, Black radicalism, liberation theology, Black and women of color feminism, etc. Most prominent of these movements has been the Black Lives Matter movement, but also the struggles of Indigenous, refugee, undocumented Asian American and working class communities organizing against the realities of gaping economic inequality, climate catastrophe, carceral violence, gender and sexual violence, and extreme political division, all of which are very much part and parcel of our current political and cultural and social landscape today. I will not date myself by revealing my age at this time, but suffice to say that unlike many of my students who are in attendance today, I remember the events of September 11th, 2001 very, very well. This past week, we have witnessed numerous tributes and memorials to the horrific violence of that day. And as a transplant to New Jersey 10 years ago from the Bay Area in California, I want to note the incredibly visceral and immediate nature of the attacks that I have felt so deeply since relocating here. As I said in an essay I published earlier this week, the subsequent global war on terror that followed did not simply target those who had perpetrated the attacks, but instead hundreds of thousands of innocent civilians caught in US dragnets spanning Iraq and Afghanistan and all across the US itself, including right here at Rutgers University in New Jersey, where in 2012, it was revealed that the NYPD had been conducting surveillance on Muslim communities and students, both at the Newark and New Brunswick campuses. There has also been an entire generation of US Muslims born and raised on American soil from the mid-1990s through the early 2000s, Gen Z Muslims, for whom there has never been a world without a war on terror, and whose engagements with their own identities, faith, and culture have emerged under the constant specter of Islamic terrorism. Of course, these notions of terror, who is a threat, who belongs and who doesn't, has everything to do with issues of race and racism, and within which logics of Blackness and anti-Blackness are integral frames. And it is against these contexts that these conversations around race, Islam, and Muslims have arisen over the past 2 decades and spurred a reckoning amongst those who teach and write on these topics to reflect far more deeply on how outdated Orientalist paradigms still relegate Islam to the Middle East, or conflate Muslims and Arabs as one and the same, or somehow forget that 1/3 of the world's 1.8 billion Muslims are in Africa, or for those of us in American and ethnic studies field that erase the foundational and ongoing legacies of Black American Muslims. These paradigms continually shape how we talk, teach, and think about Islam and Muslims, both in the academy and the public sphere, and even in the most progressive of spaces. Case in point, quite recently, a leading feminist journal that many here are likely to be familiar with, but who I will not name, published an entire special issue on transnational feminist approaches to anti-Muslim racism without one essay addressing the phenomenon in sub-Saharan Africa, nor including one Black or African author or perspective. Yet such omissions are not the exception, but generally the norm, not only in Islamic studies fields, but also in race, women's and gender, and American studies discourses, which have often uncritically taken up issues of Islamophobia and anti-Muslim racism, while omitting the existence of Black and African Muslim subjectivities and experiences. It is this sort of elision that our event speaks to today. And in this first panel, I welcome a powerhouse trio of scholars from the fields of American, ethnic, religious, and women's and gender studies fields to discuss their own engagement with Muslims, Blackness, and anti-Blackness. These will be followed by a dialogue between them, moderated by myself, which will then be opened up to the audience for questions and comments. Each panelist will speak for about 10 minutes. And then we will be in dialogue for about 20, and then we'll open up for comment for the remaining time. In the interest of time, we won't take questions or comments during the time when the panelists are speaking. However, please feel free to enter comments or questions in the chat. And a wonderful graduate student from Women's and Gender and Sexuality Studies here at Rutgers who's going to be assisting us today, Nehal Nasser, will be compiling these comments and questions, and we'll do our best to get to all of them in the closing chat. So finally, to my students who are here from American Studies 102, can you please go in the chat and send a message to Nehal, like find Nehal Nasser on the chat, and just text her here or your name so that she can mark you present. She's going to look for your names, but just in case, do that too. Finally, I would like to thank the Departments of American Studies and Women's and Gender Studies, as well as the Institute for the Study of Global Racial Justice here at Rutgers for their generous support of this event. And now please let me introduce our esteemed panelists. I'm going to do all the introductions at once right now, and then we're going to go into the 10-minute talks by each of the panelists. So I'm going in alphabetical order by last name, and this was the decision I have imposed on the panelists. So first of all, Dr. Suad Abdul Khabeer is a scholar, artist, and activist. In her most recent work, she examines the intersections of official history and the untold stories of Black women and Black Muslims through the lens of her mother's life, through a series of digital exhibitions called Umi's Archive. It's wonderful, you should go check it out online. Trained as an anthropologist, Suad's first book, Muslim Cool, Race, Religion, and Hip Hop in the United States, published in 2016, is a critically acclaimed ethnography on Islam and hip hop that examines how intersecting ideas of Muslimness and Blackness challenge and reproduce the meanings of race in the US. She is the founder of Sapelo Square, the first website dedicated to the comprehensive documentation and analysis of the Black US Muslim experience. And she has also written for The Root, The Washington Post, The Atlantic, Ebony Magazine, and Huffington Post, Religious Dispatches, and Transmissions, and has appeared on Al Jazeera English. In 2018, Suad was profiled as one of the 25 influential American Muslims by CNN and received the Soros Equality Fellowship in 2019. She is currently an associate professor of American culture and Arab and Muslim American studies at the University of Michigan. Next up, we have Dr. Zarina Graywal. She is an associate professor of American Studies and Religious Studies at Yale University. She is a historical anthropologist and documentary filmmaker whose research focuses on race, gender, religion, nationalism, and transnationalism across a wide spectrum of American Muslim communities. Her first book, Islam is a Foreign Country, American Muslims and the Global Crisis of Authority, published in 2013, is an ethnography of transnational Muslim networks that link US mosques to Islamic movements in the post-colonial Middle East through debates about the reform of Islam. Her first film, By the Dawn's Early Light, Chris Jackson's Journey to Islam, examines the racialization of Islam and the scrutiny of American Muslims' patriotism long before September 11, 2001. Her forthcoming book, titled Is the Quran a Good Book?, combines ethnographic and cultural studies analysis with historical research to trace the place of Islamic scripture in the American imagination, particularly in relation to national debates about tolerance. She has received awards for her writing and research grants from the Fulbright, Winter-Green, and Luce Foundations. Finally, today we'll have Dr. Tasneem Siddiqui, who is an assistant professor in the Department of History, Politics, and Social Justice at Winston-Salem State University. She is a member of the Africa World Now Project Media Collective, serving as a senior researcher, content contributor, production director, and associate producer for the weekly radio program Africa World Now Project. Dr. Siddiqui is a member of University, a people's educational and leadership development institution emphasizing political education in the US South. University is an educational outlet for Black Workers for Justice, an organization of Black workers organizing to build the African American workers movement as a central force in the struggle for Black liberation and workers' power. Dr. Siddiqui holds a PhD in American Studies and Ethnicity from the University of Southern California, a Master of Art in American Studies and Ethnicity, also from USC, a Master's in Social Anthropology from the London School of Economics, and a Bachelor's of Art in Anthropology from the University of California, Irvine. She is currently working on a book, which sounds amazing, Freedom is a Place, Black Self-Determination and Land-Based Struggles in the Low Country and Sea Islands. Her work explores the intersections of race, gender, categories of power, spirituality, and geography, and how historically marginalized peoples and communities produce systems of knowledge that informs their futurity and freedom. I can't wait to read that, Tasneem. And so without further ado, I want to turn it over to our first panelist, Dr. Saad Abdul Khabeer. Thank you so much for joining us today.
Thank you. Can I get a thumbs up if you can hear me? Perfect. Thank you, Sylvia, for the invitation to be on this panel with these esteemed guests who I consider colleagues and people that I learn from. So I'm really excited to sort of be in conversation today. And thank you to everyone who played a role in making this possible. I begin in the name of Allah, for the love of Muhammad, to honor the ancestors and in celebration of my people. I also begin in acknowledgement that the land upon which I am right now is the unceded and ancestral territory of the Anishinaabe and the Wyandot, and that some of us are uninvited guests, but we don't have to be. I also begin in acknowledgement of the histories of imperialism, colonialism, and resistance that brought us here today, that every day is Ashura, every land is Karbala. This question of Muslims, anti-Blackness and Blackness, and 9/11, right, in 20 years. And so it's funny because I was thinking similar to Sylvia, I also know a world before 9/11, right? I'm a New Yorker. I was in New York on 9/11. At that time, my family was in Queens, New York. And so I was in Queens. I was 22 at the time. And I remember that, but I actually remember this issue of and so one of the things about, sort of 9/11 is the way the Muslim becomes this figure, right? In ways that echo past ways, but also kind of have new formations. But my first actual kind of experience with the Muslim as this kind of racialized figure and me as being a Muslim person having to deal with that actually was with the first Iraq War. And I remember I was I was in junior high school and Islamic school, and our Islamic studies teacher was teaching us how to walk down the street. And he's like, this Iraq war is happening. There could be potential sort of like attacks. And so basically he was like, kind of walk every 13 steps. I think it was every 13 steps you should look behind you. I remember him teaching us that. So in many ways, because of that, and just being a Black person, right? So I'm a Muslim, but I'm also a Black person and a Black woman, and having a sense of this long history of white supremacy and the way it targets groups. I think when 9/11 happened for me, it was not the watershed moment that it is for some other people, but more, it was another moment that marked, right? A reality that I've been living. But it did inform kind of the work, and this is when I get to Muslims and anti-Blackness. It did inform my work in the sense that, after 9/11, and I think one of the things that brought me into scholarship on Muslims in the United States and Blackness was this kind of erasure that I saw. And so for me, as someone who was raised in a Muslim family, grew up Muslim, went to Muslim parochial school, right, was a very sort of visible Muslim my whole entire life and really engaged in Muslim communities, when the dominant white mainstream media sort of decided that Muslims were now important, my communities and the kind of Muslims that I represented or were part of were not there. And, we know erasure, and I think Sylvia mentioned this word too, erasure. Now, of course, erasure itself is a common kind of formation, right, of white supremacy. It's a way that anti-Blackness is created and recreated in the world, right? So that happened, and so in many ways, that's how I kind of came into this space. But one of the things that changed for me, and I think this is one of the challenges that I want to talk about too, talking about these topics, is in some ways, the idea of coming into this space or coming into this scholarship because of this erasure was not really just a matter of representation. So like there's an erasure, now we need to say, well, no, there are Black Muslims too. But rather it's about sort of the fundamental nature of sort of the very order of things, the very order of the world we live in. And so when I think about Blackness and anti-Blackness in my work around Muslims, they're very central, and not because, again, because Black Muslims are here too, but because of the ways that Blackness, anti-Blackness are essential, right? And fundamental and foundational to the ways the modern world we live in right now has been structured, right? For me, as in my bio, so, I'm a scholar, artist, and activist, and whatever work I do or whatever work we do in whatever medium, I really believe if it's going to be good work, it has to be attentive to the worlds we inhabit, that we work and we live in the modern world, right? So since over the last 500 years or so, is a world that was shaped, right, by European expansion and colonization. And Zarina and I are actually teaching a class right now on critical Muslim studies. And we read work by Sylvia Winter, a Black theorist, who makes this point, like others do, like Cedric Robinson does as well, this idea that kind of to make us remember, right, that this kind of European expansion, European colonization that starts kind of the structure of the modern world also starts, right, simultaneously or is co-constituted or co-constructed with kind of the development of these others, specifically Black others and Native others, right? And Native being sort of indigenous to the Western Hemisphere and Black being sort of Africans, right? And that kind of move for human progress that we also often call it, right, is animated by this question of who and what we are, right? And that's kind of has animated that thing. And the answer to that question most often is not Black, right? It's like, so who what we are as humans is not Black, right? So who what we are as humans, where, we have intellect, we have rationality, we have progress, we build things, we know things, we teach things, Black people don't do that, right? And that is something that I think is, that is something that is fundamental to sort of how everything that we, from the nation states we live in to the kind of media we consume, right? The way all of that stuff sort of began and was birthed, right, is through this idea of sort of not Black in many ways. And it affects us on sort of intimate levels, but also institutional levels. And so for that reason, if I'm going to be a scholar of any medium, right, and if I'm going to be attentive to the worlds in which I live in and work and animate, then I have to pay attention to that. So that's one way in which it's kind of really important to me. The other thing that I think why Muslims, Blackness, or anti-Blackness and Blackness in particular, are critical to the work that I do is also around the fact that I care about Black people. Right? And so it's like, I'm also interested in doing my part as a Black person, right? Because I care about myself, right? But also care about Black people and what are the sort of material conditions, and material not just in the material in the yes, food, clothing, and shelter, but also in the psychic and the psychological and the spiritual. Like, what are the material conditions that Black people are living in, and how can we improve them? And improve them for Black people, which is really to improve them for all people, right? Because of the ways in which not Black has structured, right, the modern world we live in. And so I'm really interested in that as well, right? And and I think for me too, it's important. One of the things I think about when I think about Blackness and anti-Blackness, and I talk about real life Black people, there's this abstract concept of Black people, right? And then there are real life Black people. And both of those things have to be attended to, like how we think about Black people in the abstract, and then how we think about kind of, it has an effect on like what happens to the literal lives of Black people. So those are ways, like in terms of sort of both in terms of my scholarship, just as a fundamental thing to be a scholar in this time in the 21st century, it requires, right, an attention to an investment in an understanding of Blackness and anti-Blackness. And also as a Black person, as a Black scholar, as a Black woman, as a Black artist, as a Black activist, I'm concerned also about Black people. So then my work also has to be shaped that way. I am a professor, right? I'm an associate professor. I was mentioned at the University of Michigan. I'm in American Culture Department, which is an American Studies department. And we also have like ethnic studies units. And so I'm also connected to one that's called Arab and Muslim American Studies. And, Blackness, and so what's interesting about that is that the program that I'm part of, Arab and Muslim American Studies, emerges, right, from the work of scholars like Evelyn El-Sultani, and I'm forgetting Nadine's last name right now, but they do this precisely because 9/11 marks a movement, right? Marks the ways in which the Muslim as a figure continues to sort of be recreated into this new thing, right? And because that's happening, and because that's happening in the abstract sense, right? In terms of discourse and conversations and media representations, and also having very real, tangible effects on everyday people's lives, right? Wanting to sort of bring what scholarship can bring, right? To sort of understanding what that is. So I'm in this space. And so one of the things about that space, or being in this space, is both kind of, there's a promise, right? Because yes, racialization is happening, right? People who are of a range of different kinds of people, right? From a range of parts of the world, with a range of different kinds of personalities and sensibilities and cultures and languages, are kind of being grouped under this Muslim thing and being targeted for it. So that's happening. And so there's a promise of us really sort of investigating that. But sometimes, and this goes back to the journal Meridians that did that piece, right? Or that series didn't have any Black people, like there was no work on Black people, and there were no Black people doing work, right? In that, I think also one of the things that happens that's a problem, or in that space. And so when I come into that space, what I'm trying to do is I'm trying to say, okay, wait a minute, like, we have this Arab Muslim dyad that has been constructed that is fundamentally anti-Black, right? Because of the way it erases, right? In the ways that white supremacy erases. And so we need to then sort of problematize that and kind of undo it, right, in the ways we can. So like in a classroom situation, sometimes that means bringing in, right, different kinds of work, but it's not just, again, I think this is for me, something that I've been thinking about a lot actually, and I'm gonna kind of close out on this point. The difference between representation, like, and inclusion. How we have in the university this diversity, equity, inclusion kind of framework, and we're going to include people. And this is the idea, we're going to add another color to like the rainbow, whatever it is, right? And that is supposed to be something that is useful, but in fact, it's not actually useful, because I think the inclusion, thinking about Blackness and anti-Blackness is not just saying, oh, there are Black Muslims too, or there are all these kind of people who are Muslim and Black Muslims who are part of them, right? But rather it's about thinking about, I guess the word I might use is epistemology, right? Foundation, the very order of things, right? And I find that this kind of, we're going to include, so first people were like, y'all are anti-Black because y'all don't talk about Black people, right? We talk about Muslims and anti-Muslim racism and 9/11, right? Okay. So people were like, okay, well, we're going to do that. And recently there was that cover of, I think it's Time magazine, and it was like you know, they were like this new generation of Muslims. So like it's the politicians and actors, and so there are people like Mahershala Ali on it, and Rami who does that show, and like Rashida Tlaib, all these different people on the cover, right? And they're like, at least half of them are Black. So now we can't be like, y'all anti-Black, right? Because you got Black people on there. But I think for me, the thing is, or the thing that I want to trouble, or that I want to sort of push us and push against, is not just kind of being like, okay, so we're going to add a couple of Black people in, but rather take seriously, right, the ways that anti-Blackness has structured even the idea of the Muslim. And then when we engage the idea of the Muslim, whether it's at the level of an individual Muslim, whether it's in the organizing you're doing, whether it's in the teaching you're doing, whether it's in the scholarship you're doing, when we then engage, right, this figure of the Muslim, right, that's informed by anti-Blackness, how do we then engage it and not reproduce it at the same time? So that's the space I'm in right now, right? I'm thinking about that. Like, how do we do that? How do we recognize how these things come together, recognize Muslim as a racialized category, but not reproduce anti-Blackness in the process of doing that? So that's where I am. Thank you.
So much. That's a really wonderful provocation and questions to start with. And I'm going to turn it over to our next speaker, Dr. Zarina Graywall. Thank you.
Thanks so much. It's an honor to be here, and I just want to echo the thanks that that Sawad made to everyone who put this together, especially to Sylvia. I have to confess, I'm actually in the middle of moving homes, and I probably would never have said yes if it had not been Sylvia that invited me. I am not able to say no to her because I love her, and I'm just really happy to be here to think with you today. And I should say, and Mark also, that I am zooming in, in this moment of crisis, of pandemic, this biopolitical event that is the pandemic, from my home, which is, of course, in Quinnipiac lands, where Quinnipiac continue to live and work. And I just want to say that because, we've had a lot of talk in the last week about that other biopolitical event of September 11th. And, I think we're, some of the ones of us that have spoken so far I think are around the same age. So I was in college at the time, and it has certainly shaped my activist life, my intellectual life, my life as a Muslim. But for me, what I always emphasize is that September 11th amplified things that already existed. That's what my film is about. That in fact, when I screen, and I think that film, which is about Mahmoud Abdul Rauf, who was essentially the Kaepernick of the 90s, became more relevant in 2015, and showing it to students and audiences since then, it's shocking how much of the 90s, how similar and also different, i.e. like less scary, the 90s seemed when it comes to questions around patriotism and race and the policing of Muslims and belief. But the point being that none of this is new, whether we're talking about the policing of Muslims, the surveillance, racism, white supremacy, all of the kinds of intractable problems. And I wanted to also just say that, those are the things that I'm obsessed with. That's what I think about in the shower. That's what I think about all the time. But I didn't come to those questions through a course pack in a class. I was raised in Detroit suburbs in Michigan, which is, there's 10 states that have that most American Muslims live in. Michigan is one of them. It's usually represented as, the Middle East and the Midwest, Dearborn and all of that. But I actually did not grow up in Dearborn. People often introduce me, thank you, Sylvia, for not introducing me from Dearborn, but I often get introduced as being from Dearborn just because I'm from Michigan. I actually grew up both in a Punjabi community in part of Detroit that was both Punjabi and Black, and then we moved to the suburbs, which was a very white suburb, but on the border. If you've seen the movie 8 Mile, I grew up on 9 Mile, sort of 1 mile into whiteness, but there was constant racial clashes all through my life that structured my life. In fact, for me, going to preschool my parents, were struck by how once we moved to the suburbs, I actually was picking up more and more Black English. The reason was because the teacher wouldn't actually teach me and the one other Black girl in my class. And so we had been relegated to a different table, and I learned all my English from her. So that mystery was solved. My parents pulled me out of the school. But I mean, I guess what I'm saying is for me, the idea that I was a racialized subject, or that I, that I was, me and Kayla were together, that idea was something that I learned when I was 5. It didn't take 9/11 for me to understand that Muslims are a racialized population. And I can talk about many other instances in my life where it was very clear. The Rushdie crisis around Satanic Verses novel is another one where there was actually, that's the first instance where, someone that I knew had a knife pulled out at her at the bus stop. My dad's best friend's house got smoke bombed, where there was kind of anti-Muslim racial violence that was because we were Muslim. So that happened, when I was a bit older, but there are always these instances. And then I should also say that, the kind of community that I grew up in, my primary Muslim community, as I said, was a Punjabi community, but it was very working class. And, of the sort of 10 families that we saw most frequently on the weekends, half of those men were married to women that came from Pakistan and from Punjab. And the other half of them were married to Black and Chicana women. Now, I'm not saying that to say they're the good ones. That's not at all what I'm saying. What I'm saying is that part of what's happened in both our fields, but also in the kind of dominant representations of South Asian and Middle Eastern communities, is that we're all represented as part of this upwardly mobile, kind of brain drain immigrant class. Not all of us are part of that. And so I was both exposed to racism, anti-Blackness, and anti-racism, and love of Black Muslim people in that community that I grew up in. And it has profoundly structured both my scholarly work, my personal work, how I make friends to this day, and how I live my life. And so for me, the concept of the Ummah was both a point of inspiration, but also a problem. In other words, it was this aspiration that we are tied collectively as Muslims, globally, here, politically, all of those things. And yet daily life is a constant reminder of all the ways the Ummah concept is used to create, to create the kind of erasures that Claude was talking about. Sydney, could you just mute yourself? I think your mic's on. And so that was, a question that as I said, I began with from my childhood, but carried into my scholarship. I think that's the question that's both at the heart of the documentary film that I mentioned, and also my first book, Islam as a Foreign Country. People often, that book is about religious debates and authority, but as I narrate in the book, the story is about how those debates came out of racial conflict in mosques over who was the leader and how authority was determined in the first place. And then, people have all different kinds of ways of grappling with the questions of, how do we know what we know about what Allah wants us to do? Who is in authority and by what metric? Is learning Arabic enough, and is having traditional classical Islamic training overseas enough or not, or why? What does it mean to have an accent and be at the pulpit or on CNN? All of those questions to me came out of first a racial fracture within a community that was trying to come together, praying next to each other in the mosque, but not necessarily understanding one another, or even being able to work together, or even actually supporting each other as they ought to do. And so in that way, I felt I've grappled with those questions and that frustration with people I love, and also turn introspectively for myself about the ways in which I reproduce the injustices in my communities, or may, and how to work against that. And so I feel like that first book, the question I most often get posed about my first book is, well, you describe all these religious debates, and I do the, from Salafi to Sufi, I interview a lot of different kinds of Muslims that are seeking Islamic knowledge and seeking the questions to the big answers to the big questions. And I don't take any particular position I'm just trying to sort of dissect those debates and show you a picture of them ethnographically, descriptively. But there is a normative argument in that book. It's just not about Islamic religious debates, because frankly, I don't think anyone cares what I think about theological questions, fiqh, or anything else, unless you're my kid, and then you're going to learn Islam as I teach it to you. But if you're a reader of my book, I'm not considered a religious scholar in that way. So I didn't include my own perspective, but I am making a normative argument in my book about race and about what we've had mentioned a couple times today about the foundational Blackness of Islam in the United States. And what that means to me, as Sawad just put so beautifully, is not just that we include, Black Muslim subjects in our representations, but that we understand that Black Muslims matter to the story of Islam in the United States, even when there are no Black Muslims in the room. That you cannot just do a study and just ignore that larger structuring, element. And it's both ahistoric, it's politically wrong. It's you miss so much. And so after getting, my PhD and working in several fields that I feel identified with, which is American studies, ethnic studies, anthropology, but also Islamic studies and religious studies. One of the frustrations is to see the inability to really grapple in American studies and ethnic studies with Islam as a religion, and in Islamic studies and religious studies. And also, I have to say, in anthropology, the inability to really grapple with race and Blackness, even when talking about an argument that proposes to be, like, let's say, anti-racist. And so, what I think there's a number for a good, one of the ways I grappled with that actually is to go outside the academy. For 10 years, I was the director of research on American Muslims at ISPU, Institute for Social Policy and Understanding. And that is what I did on nights and weekends, because I wanted the scholarly work that was being done about American Muslims to account for these questions that I was having trouble getting at. And I wanted it to have a public. I wanted to have access to a public to think those things through. And so just this, I see I'm getting the signal to kind of wrap. I mean, I will just say, I made this more autobiographical than maybe I had initially intended. But, when I think in the last week about all the ways in which 9/11 has been memorialized or not, I think it's been a very domestic focus, frankly, which has been deeply troubling to me, because ultimately I think it, reinscribes all of the imperial logics that we're supposed to be criticizing right now, at least in this moment when we look at the scale of violence committed at 9/11. For me, I can tell you, I mean, my students have been profiled by the NYPD, the Yale students, Yale Muslim students in 2012. My husband's family member was killed. His family was killed in a drone strike. The war has touched us. As I write about in the book, my Sunday school teacher, one of my Sunday school teachers is Imam Luqman, who was murdered by the FBI. And so for me, all of that political violence is connected. And I think to be responsible in this moment, we have to always be finding ways in the classroom and beyond the classroom to make those links, to show the long, as in century-long history of policing and surveillance of Muslims in this country, and longer, and we can go longer too, but the continuous, right? The ways in which the very logics of the war on terror are. I mean, so someone told me, oh, the part about Imam Luqman in your book is, before Black Lives Matter and all of that stuff. So it's prescient. I was like, well, it's not prescient if you're paying attention to the people who live in Detroit, right? It's like so obvious, everyone knows it. It's not like, do you know what I mean? So the book was published in 2013. I mean, this was always a part of our lives as communities. So, I'm marking this moment thinking of the people who are political prisoners who are still in US prisons. And when I think about them, I'm not only thinking about the people that were part of Ayana or Holy Land, other Muslim charities, but also, the people that were from Imam Luqman's community, who are still in prison. So that, in other words, how do we come to connect these dots when we think about US empire? How do we tell stories that both acknowledge the specificities of our different Muslim communities, both in the US and around the world, but also are able to account for the ways in which somebody who's living in Senegal can encounter, which is what my first book is about, can encounter somebody from Detroit and have a coherent and meaningful relationship, conversation, debate, because they're both Muslim. So what does that mean? So that's really the big questions. Those are the big questions for me. And I'm just happy to think with you. And I'm also in the later discussion, happy to mention some of the texts that I use to try to make those links in the classroom and beyond.
Thank you so much, Zarina. Thanks for such provocative comments and some questions I definitely want to get back to in the discussion. Last but not least, I'd like to welcome Tasneem Siddiqui. And I just really wanted to quickly mention, Tasneem, you teach at Winston-Salem State, which is a historically Black college in the US South. And so that kind of, really, I think is important to mention in this moment of teaching and talking about this topic. So I'm so glad you're here to share with us. Looking forward to your comments.
Thank you so much, Sylvia, for inviting me to participate in this critical conversation and really co-create new knowledge with our esteemed colleagues. We don't do this work in isolation. Even when we put pen to page, we do so collaboratively and in community. As Dr. Suad and Sylvia had done in the beginning, I always start with an intention in verbal libations. So Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. May the most merciful artist, the hidden, bless this space that we're co-creating. We send remembrance and blessings upon our ancestors, both known and unknown, upon the unborn and our children, whom we are called upon to tend and care for this land, to create life-affirming systems for them to inhabit joy and peace, balance and generosity, to walk a path of righteousness and integrity, and really walk a path of beauty. So we honor our Africana, Indigenous, First Nations ancestors and relations, and we acknowledge that we inhabit and occupy the unceded ancestral lands. And where I am located right now is Nakotchtok, Piscataway, Anacostan, Lumbi. And I want to also think about our African and Indigenous ancestors and present communities in Haiti, Palestine, Tanzania, all over the African and Indigenous world, and all places that are fighting for the protection and preservation of all life. So we accept these duties and responsibilities that we're charged with to restore balance, harmony, and justice. And so I want to say on the onset that I don't exclusively write about Islam and Muslims. My research and my teaching and my personal and intellectual curiosities are steeped in the African and Africana experience, in the ancient and modern worlds. So my research and curricular approaches to history, because I'm located in a history department, is an Africana studies perspective to history. And it's really important to emphasize that Africana studies is an insurrectionary knowledge tradition that comes out of the struggle for life itself, right? That comes out of the struggles and movements for human liberation, for Black liberation, which is inclusive. So this perspective to history, my perspective to history that I take is an African and Africana-centered history, in which I echo the praxis of someone like W.E.B. Du Bois, in particular, as Sylvia had mentioned, that I'm situated at a HBCU, where we have a radically different student population, and most of the students enrolled in my courses are of African descent or African, so about 99% of my students. And a great majority of my students have at least one family member who is Muslim, like a brother, a sister, an aunt, a grandparent, a parent, and more than likely, as a matter of a fact, have an ancestor who is Muslim. It's important for us to remember the large population of enslaved Africans of Africans who are Muslim who are enslaved, in the US South and the Americas. So I will return to this point because it's crucial as we map these continuities of Islam in African and Africana systems of thought and ways of being. So really to kind of return to this point with Du Bois, particularly with regard where I'm situated within academic institutions and with respect to the field and function of historically Black colleges and universities, and that HBCUs, particularly if we think about the trajectory of HBCUs and in this relationship to Black social movements, right? We must rest ourselves on this high ground of unfaltering facing of the truth, to provide for the world a lens through which to interpret all history, one that looks to Africa to interpret and understand the social development of all humankind in all ages. So therefore, my approach to education and knowledge and my research centers Africa. the birthplace of humanity and people of African descent. And really understanding these histories and socio-political processes, indigenous knowledge systems that are integral to the human story, provides a means of socio-political, spiritual, and intellectual liberation. So this is not to say that the terrain of HBCUs are unscathed or that they are maroon spaces within the academy. We have to create those spaces of marinage in these places where we're located. And there are many Africana scholars who have engaged in these generative critiques of HBCUs. My dear friend and collaborator and colleague, James Pope and Kamal Rashid had actually offered this brilliant meditation on these questions, these critiques and futures of Black labor and the white architects of Black education on our media and educational platform, Africa World Now Project, to which I'm going to return to that in a minute because it's so central in terms of the research and the public scholarship that we do collectively. So my courses and my research really explore these histories and systems of knowledge of ancient Africa. And as those histories and systems of knowledge and people come into collision course with the development of racial capitalism, the age of conquest, colonialism, imperialism, chattel slavery, and these various forms of incarceration. And modalities, and this is the most crucial point, is this modalities of resistance, the Black radical tradition. Right. So when we think about resistance, this is the highest form of asserting one's humanity is to resist. And I'm thinking a lot about Cedric Robinson, which I'll talk about in a moment. So in my courses, we really examine these makings of race, gender, class, spatial formations as they are constituent parts of the processes of reorganizing our understanding of ancient societies and the production of human societies, of redefining what it means to be human and all forms of life, and then also to look at the production of private property. So when we pay particular attention to these processes that mapped and shaped modernity, this mapping is critical and it's intricately linked to Islam, Muslims, and Blackness, because Blackness is a product of modernity. So into talking about having these conversations of Islamophobia and anti-Blackness, which is very old, African-centered scholars even map these sort of proto-formations of anti-Blackness across 4,000 years with this destruction of ancient indigenous Indus Valley societies and invasions into ancient Kemet and Kush. So in any semester, I cover thousands of years of history. I'm actually doing that right now in the 4 classes that I teach. And just kind of, really positioning this long history of Islamophobia, I'm thinking about, historians like Peter Linebaugh and more recently Roxanne Dunbar-Artis, who remind us, like many others, that these European institutions, this worldview of conquest and colonialism, which is intricately tied to Islamophobia, from the 11th to the 13th centuries, Europeans conducted these crusades to conquer North Africa and the Middle East that led to unprecedented wealth in the hands of a few. And we can even talk about this racialization of Africa, which we should, bifurcating North Africa from sub-Saharan Africa. So these anti-Muslim crusades were really these attempts to control not only the lucrative Muslim trade routes to the Far East, but it resulted in massive violence, dispossession, displacement, extraction of wealth and wealth of knowledge. Later, this knowledge really helped formulate the trade routes into interior parts of Africa, primarily these sources of gold. So there's this materiality to the Crusades that we really need to talk about. And the Enlightenment period, which is the product of the Crusades, the product of the Inquisition, the expulsion of African Muslims and Jews from the Iberian Peninsula, chattel slavery, indigenous dispossession, displacement, these policies and practices of extermination of indigenous and African peoples. So these are some of the fundamental challenges and obstacles to doing this work, because there exists incredible ignorance about these histories, not only within the academy, but also within the general public. And what gets pandered as history and history of the West is based on a lot of fiction. So how this really plays out in my own research, when I think about the manuscript that I'm working on right now, which is Freedom is a Place, it really focuses on this holistic understanding of land-based struggles that are waged by people of African descent and communities. So I really engage, while we think about this landscape of African indigenous knowledge, it's really important to position Islam within that landscape of African indigenous knowledge. Islam is always sort of seen as something that is a foreign import into Africa, but instead of looking at as part of this larger spiritual heritage that comes out of the continent. So I engage African Indigenous knowledge systems, Black geographies, which is the spatial expression of Africana studies, and these provide a methodology for understanding the spiritual, which is incredibly important. You're talking about peoples of African descent. Spirituality must come into play, and we must have that conversation. Spiritual, material, and metaphysical inhering in the life worlds of people and communities of African descent, which they created these communities, these ways of thinking about land, of nature, thinking about community is not just about other human beings, but other forms of life as well, the material and the non-material, and how these forms of social organization and governance, these forms of types of economies were created and recreated within this violence of modernity. So the work that I'm really trying to engage is to engage these epistemic frameworks of African Indigenous knowledge to really deeply pursue and understand this Black geographic thought and praxis, this praxis of community buildings, the life worlds that are created in the Low Country and Sea Island communities in order for us to elicit a theory of social organization, of political governance, of economic activity that provide radical alternatives to a racial capitalist society. And this is key. I mean, this is what, when we think about particularly the ways in which policies in their long history of policies against Black Muslims in this country goes back into documented 1920s, even earlier than that as well. And part of the racialization is this active process of liberation, right? So my study intends to really be descriptive and prescriptive as the urgency of our contemporary moment demands this type of critical scholarship, particularly as we think about, so a lot of us have been, sort of talked about our own personal lives and life stories. We are thinking about the histories, the types of life systems, life ways, modes of being, and ways of knowledge that our ancestors continually reminded us of and continually put out strategies and tactics, plotted a path for us, a course for us to survive in this place, right? And perhaps in places thrive. So to create beauty, community spaces, life under these destroying systems of modernity in terms of racial capitalism, white supremacy, heteropatriarchy, incarceration, and I can go on, but you guys all know what I'm talking about. So, and to think about the ways that we can collectively heal. How do we reconstitute ourselves? How do we regenerate our worlds? How do we foment radical social transformation? These modalities of beings and forms of social organization and sociality, these forms of governance and philosophies of life and ethics, of living. And so where we're writing in this space and we find ourselves in this space of the academy, the ways in which our beings and our ways of knowing and our ways of understanding as African and African descended people, as Indigenous people, exceed and rather to the point precede Western epistemologies and Western epistemic frameworks. And so we have to really understand that when we are engaging, right, in these radical different ontological and epistemic worldviews, we are coming to a sense of remembering and a sense of wholeness as well. And this is really the necessity and the intervention of Africana studies that links African Indigenous knowledge systems. So I'm thinking about just being in the tradition of scholars like Cedric Robinson, Sylvia Wynter, W.E.B. Du Bois, C.L.R. James, Clyde Woods, Ivan Van Sertima, Martin Delaney, Harry Highland Garnett, which they instructively remind us that the disciplines that have created these sort of European epistemologies that have created these modes of existence and categories of life didn't actually map onto the way that African people really live. And so this creates an opening when we're thinking about Muslims, Islam, Blackness, anti-Blackness, we really think about sort of the coming together, or to think, I would say, actually more expansively of what Africana studies is, what Black studies is, and more particularly what Black study is, and to do these ways of knowledge production and how we understand and read our world radically differently. So this is some of the work that I'm engaged in right now. And I want to also say, like, when I work on the media platform Africa World Now project, I'm sort of tying into through my own research, like this is the work that we do. It's really connecting the African world to think about, you know, these issues of spirituality, economics, cultural production, political governance. And so some of the places that my own research is going, particularly around spirituality and looking at African spiritual systems holistically, I'm really engaging traditional African history. And I want to do, you know, to talk about some of the work that our elders, Nubia Kai, who is a scholar coming out of Detroit, who's done some of this work as well, is to reposition the way that we think about Islam within the African continent and within the academy. And so in order to do that, she looks at these traditional forms of African historiography and historicity, right? And looking at the ways in which we think about history substantially different from Western historical constructs. And it's generally dismissed by Western educated scholars, both Black and white, that African historical records and genealogies, for example, when we think about locating Islam within African spiritual systems and spiritual traditions, and this is not to elide the universal nature of message of Islam, but it's also to reposition it, and instead of thinking about Black Muslims as outside or inauthentic, right? Is to go back and look at these African historical records and genealogies that consistently affirm a Cushitic, Kemetic, Hebrew, Canaanite, and Afro-Arab identity or line of descent that positions African people as founders and organizers of not only ancient Kemetic and Egyptian spiritual systems, but also the Judeo-Christian Islamic religious traditions, and how these spiritual traditions are linked, right? They're indelibly linked to a moral and philosophical continuum that flows like a river of prophecy out of the continent, each tributary leading to new social and cultural revolutions, to radical social transformation, right? A recalibration of how we go about being human amongst other humans and amongst other forms of life. So this African spiritual tradition has undergone, and this is where we have to reclaim it as people of African descent, particularly, right? That this African spiritual tradition has undergone a major usurpation and appropriation by Western epistemologies, right? And so so much so that many African descended scholars are even confused over these questions of origin. So our purpose has to be to utilize these traditional sources of history, right? Mende historiography that comes out of the long line of Sangomas, you know, the historiography that comes out of, and this is very important, and a lot of scholars are doing this work as well, West African Sufi tariqas, okay? To reclaim this legacy in its entirety and really to reclaim the spiritual heritage of Africa and the ways in which we can think about how to create systems, social systems, right? Political systems, forms of governance that center the human being, that are compassionate forms of governance, compassionate forms of economics, compassionate forms of how we socially organize. And that's the best of our traditions. And I think that that's where the work really needs to start to move to. And I hope that I can give my modest contribution to that. So I just want to end with the words of Chinua Achebe, that Africa is not only a geographic expression, but it is also a metaphysical language and the metaphysical landscape. It is in fact a view of the world and of the whole cosmos perceived from a particular position. So I thank you all for your gift of presence, and I look forward to a robust conversation.
Thank you so much, Tasneem and Saad and Zarina. Zarina, Professor Graywall is having a little bit of internet connectivity, so she may not turn her camera on for a minute. Hopefully that'll resolve itself. But first of all, I wanted to thank you so much for three different, approaches to our topic today, Muslims, Blackness, and Anti-Blackness, that really emphasize, as a number of you touched upon this word, the different epistemological positions that we take as scholars to do our work. And what I heard, kind of broadly taking in the very rich and diverse perspectives and theories and frameworks that you're bringing in is that really for all of us and for all three of you and myself as well, there is a very basic interconnection between, as you said, within the fields of Africana studies in which Islam is central. And you said something, Zarina, in which you said, even when Black Americans or African Americans or Black Muslims are not in the room, they are there in the history. And just, kind of the vice versa, even when you are talking about Blackness and kind of histories of Blackness, Islam is also always in the room, especially when you're talking about the diaspora or African subjectivities. So I wanted to start with that. And I wanted to ask you about just, we don't have that much time, like some future directions in particular that you would like to see in your respective fields and more broadly within the larger public discourse around Islam and Muslims. Maybe you could, kind of offer some thoughts on that and maybe talk a little bit about reflecting on the last 2 decades as this has really been a time in which this conversation has arisen in these different spaces. So one, what would you like to see in your scholarly and academic disciplines? And what have you seen that has shifted in the last 20 years since the events of 9/11? And also I want to add, if folks in the audience want to contribute questions and comments, now would be the time to start posing some questions to our panelists in the chat. So go ahead and whoever wants to go first, that would be great. If not, I'll call on people. So do you want to, since you were first in speaking, you've had time to reflect now. Maybe you can go first in answering the question.
I don't think I should go first. I think that's unfair, but it's okay.
Life's not fair.
Your question was about future and what have I seen, right? That was the question. So in terms of what I guess I'll start what I've seen in the past 20 years. I think I've seen, and I think going to my point about this difference between Blackness as like representation versus Blackness as sort of foundation in a way. I think I've seen really this kind of re-entrenchment. And one of the places that I focus a lot on, due to, so my work with like my first book, Muslim Cool, and, it's kind of, what they call, I think I got this term from Natasha Sharma, intra-minority relations is a term people use, like how, like, not how we deal with white folks, but how like people who are not white, Black, Indigenous people, Asian Americans, how we deal with each other, right? And so, I think one of the things that I've seen over the last 20 years, I guess that's concerning, I guess that's the way I think about it, is a kind of, a sort of a re-entrenchment of, or how do I want to say this? A kind of reproduction of the racialization that we're experiencing through like the pursuit of particular kinds of access. So there's a term I like to use, I don't even know if I invented it. I think someone else did, I don't know who it was, but heard, but professional Muslim, right? Is a term that I like to use, right? So people who like, and by professional Muslim, I mean, people whose job it is to be Muslims, right? Like, and many of us can play that role in different spaces, but particularly in the media, because so sort of a media role that kind of outsizes anything else they do, right? So you might be a professor, you might get interviewed by your local newspaper, but that doesn't make you a professional Muslim. But like if you're the person they call you're the person that everyone's calling all the time, then.
Just really quick, like on the Daily Show, where it was a joke, but they had like the Muslim correspondent, right, which was Hassan Minhaj. Yeah, okay.
Right. So anyway, so I think that role is not a role that Muslims themselves have created. I think that's a role that's been created by sort of dominant white supremacist structures that need to have people be certain types, right? So this is your type and this is your type and your type, right? So now Muslim is a thing. We want to talk about it in some way, so we need to have the Muslim. The problem with that is the Muslim type, the racialization of the Muslim type is non-Black and is anti-Black. So therefore then the people who get chosen, right, or get called to be professional Muslims are then themselves not Black people. And then there's a question of a responsibility, right? So it's kind of like, that happens, you didn't create that structure, right? So you're not responsible for the creation of it, but what is our roles and how do we participate in it, right? And if we're really concerned about undoing anti-Muslim racism, then we have to be concerned about undoing anti-Blackness. And so we can't then sort of be in a position where we're reproducing anti-Blackness. We're never going to get we're never going to get rid of anti-Muslim racism. So it doesn't matter how many panels you've been on, and how many shows you're on, no matter how many times you do that. Like if you're reproducing anti-Blackness, you're never going to get anti-Muslim racism. So that's one thing that I've seen. And then the other thing for the future, what I'd like to see, I guess, is I think that we live in a world in which, and it's funny because Tasneem mentioned Du Bois, and I love to think about Du Bois because Du Bois is, I mean, he's like this, we think of him, we think of him as a scholar. He's a novelist. He's an organizer. There are all these different things that he's doing, right? All united by his commitment to Black liberation. And I think we live in a world where we're invited to divest ourselves from doing different things and being in different places and being, having multiple roles and being in, you're the scholar and you're the activist and you're the organizer and you're the artist, this kind of thing. And in fact, and I think we lose because of that. And so I think in terms of the future of this question around Muslims and Islam and anti-Blackness and Blackness, we need to sort of I think the future only is possible if we kind of bring things and people back together again, if that makes sense, right? So I think whether that could be something that happens in your like syllabi, right? But also in your personal lives and just in relationships. I think the relationality for the individual to have multiple parts and be able to sort of situate yourself in multiple places, but also for different kinds of people to be in together. Because I think that, and I'll end here, I was thinking about this, and even with my critique of the professional Muslim, it's like, it's a constellation of roles and people that we need in order to sort of reach this end goal of freedom or whatever we want to call it, right? We need a constellation and we need people to do. And so I feel like trying to get back to or trying to form those constellations is what I would like to see in the future.
I mean, I think, so what you were just saying, Saad, it echoes so much of what both Tasneem and Zarina were saying as well, which I kind of got from both of you, to kind of find this sense of wholeness and fullness and recuperation, that this balkanization of like, okay, now we're studying Muslims and that means these people. And now we're studying Black studies and it means these people. And it takes away so much of that complexity and multifacetedness. And, Tasneem, you did this beautiful genealogy of all the different types of knowledges that come into all of those spaces and are kind of really is syncretic in the way the knowledge emerges. So yeah, I mean, I heard that across all three of your remarks. For Tasneem and Zarina, what about you? What have you, and we have a few questions in the chat I see as well, but I wanted to also ask you, since we have about 15 more minutes, what are some future directions that you would like to see to try to bridge some of these very arbitrary divisions? And what have you seen in terms of the last 20 years that are things we need to be aware of and be critical and acknowledge in our work and our activism?
If you don't mind, Tasneem, I could start, or would you rather go ahead? Doesn't matter. Okay. So I have a couple of things in the previous way that you formulated the question, Sylvia. You brought up that I had said that even when there's no Black Muslims in the room, what foundational means is that Black Muslim presence is always there because of history. That it's history plus. It's actually going to what Saad was just saying, which is that if you care about anti-Muslim racism and the war on terror, you will not understand the architecture of that unless you understand anti-Black racism. One of my favorite texts to teach, and I teach this I've taught this in mosques, in high schools, at university, in many places, is a documentary film called Do Not Resist. And it's a documentary film that does not have any characters in it, which is very hard to do. It's a documentary film that takes the object to be the institution of policing in the United States. And it is in a post-Ferguson moment, but it traces all the ways in which the war on terror, has we're no longer dealing with the militarization of the police, that we are dealing with militias now in the United States because of the war on terror. But also the war on terror is, as we've been talking about today, so deeply linked to the, centuries-long anti-Black racism that this empire was built on. And so there are numerous moments that just capture the very function of the way this society is structured and how both depend on each other and are co-constituting. So that's one example. Another thing that I use to teach is I'll teach Moynihan. So I'll teach the Moynihan report, which we all know is about pathologizing Black families. But then I also teach Moynihan's policy recommendations for the Middle East, which are also deeply racist. So there's always ways to tie things together. What the kind of imperial arguments that Moynihan wants to make about US empire in the quote unquote Muslim world, which was at that point a new term, right? That is informed in every way by his deeply racist imaginary about the Black family and Black families and Black community and what's wrong with them. So the pathologization of Islam itself is constituted out of the pathologization of Black people. And so that's what I think we have to always draw our attention to, because there's so many kind of people, I think we're talking about the public as well as kind of students and scholars. I also want to say, we keep getting these reports about statistics in the Muslim community and like the shrinking number of Black Muslims as a piece of the kind of larger pie of US Muslims. So this demographic anxiety, so there's many ways to come at this question. But what I'm trying to say about, if you understand Islam, Black Islam and Black Muslims as foundational to the story of Islam in the United States, they don't have to be a third. We don't have to have a third in order to like talk about Arabs, Desis, and Black people. Do you see what I mean? That's what I was trying to get at when I was saying Black Muslims don't have to be in the room to matter to all of us. Actually, you don't have, they just do matter, because that's the way history played out in this part of the world, in this empire. And so that's just the point that I want to kind of emphasize. And it's built on a kind of misunderstanding of the way policy works, which is that it's somehow related to demographics. Muslims will very quickly actually outnumber Jewish Americans if Pew's projections are correct, happen relatively soon. That is not going to radically change on itself our policies in Israel and Palestine. What changing that is other things, and I hope we do see a change there. But that's just one small point. As far as what I want to see happen, I think we've come a long way. We look at the kind of the fields that Islamic studies, I was a Sherman Jackson student in the wake of 9/11. At that time, it was people talking about immigrant and indigenous categories that no longer make any sense. I think we can just completely dismiss those kinds of binaries that we've proven unhelpful. I think we can look at another kind of transdisciplinary disciplines, fields that have emerged, like critical secularism studies, critical security studies, that actually go across these different, ethnic studies silos of, Black studies, Asian American studies. I mean, I'll tell you, I love Sama Mahmood and Ali Yarhamha, but when she blurbed my book, she said something about how it's the story of, second-gen immigrant Muslims. Even though there are as many Black Muslim young people seekers in that book as there are any Arabs or South Asians, but it's just that constant inability, even among very bright people, to see what the Muslim community is, because of what Suad was just talking about, who's been set up to be the default Muslim. And so I think institutionally we need to build, I really like what Suad said about the Muslim and Arab program, which had very good intentions, but is functionally built on a contradiction. I have a postdoc at Yale called The Racialization of Islam, which, there was a lot of pushback about whether that was a truly Islamic studies postdoc, or could it be an ethnic studies postdoc, or where does it belong? And maybe racialization of Islam is also a poorly worded formation. Maybe critical Muslim studies will be something, or maybe not. Maybe it's just critical and studies behind any noun. I mean, I don't know. That's what Swat and I are trying to work through this semester. But I think that we need institutional spaces as well as the language to be able to capture both what's happening on the ground as well as these structures that shape our lives.
We just have 5 minutes left. Tasneem, I want to give you the last word. And if we have a minute or two left, I really want to quickly read out the comments and questions. And perhaps if folks can stay a few minutes, like I said, we have another panel starting at 4:30. I just want to make sure those questions are acknowledged. But Tasneem, I wanted to hear, I wanted to give you the kind of last word on those questions about what you'd like to see and what you have been seeing.
Sure, thank you. So to answer some of that question, I feel like I kind of laid some of it out in my presentation in terms of what I would like to see. And for me, and similarly to Suad, I'm more concerned about how we engage each other, right? But we're also working within the terms of the terrains of a white supremacist, racial capitalist, heteropatriarchal framework as well. I'm concerned about the ways that our differences as African and Indigenous peoples, peoples of color, are being weaponized against each other. I mean, and this is a work of race, right? This is a work of gender. This is a work of class in order to do that. So developing really these critical consciousness in terms of like, I think one of the question was, there was a question about, how do we talk about, I just wanted to go back to, how does one address Afrocentric claims that Islam is inherently anti-Black? And so that's what I'm talking about when I'm saying that, because I'm seeing that a lot in terms of like, social media, some of these conversations that somehow Islam and Muslims are outside of the frame of when we think about, what it means to be people of African descent, right? This sort of varied landscape of our Indigenous knowledge system. So I'm leaning more into really exploring for myself and for my students African Indigenous knowledge systems, and not just related to, thinking about in policy is important, but thinking about where are we going beyond struggle. So when we think about Islam itself, Islam is in itself, it's a revolutionary form of social transformation, and it's not just revolutionary in terms of like our material and external circumstances, but it's the revolution that has to happen within, right? And I think one of the things in terms of like being in the academy and being an academic, you can't talk about spirituality. You can't talk about, how our knowledge needs to be used towards creating a better world, a better human society, because right now we're really thinking about, the extinction of life on the planet when we think about climate change. So it's about how do we use our systems of knowledge if we're organizers or activists. And we have to be in all spaces and places. We have to be doing cultural production. I love this, bringing back Du Bois into our conversation. Du Bois did everything, right? People like Sylvia Winter as well, so we have to do the work of having one foot in the academy, but also in which everyone I think in this room does. So it's just really kind of like a reaffirmation of our efforts, and having one foot in the community and bringing those together, especially for us that are really located in Africana Studies. Africana Studies centers not the academy, but the community, right? And this is where we derive our understanding and our knowledge, and then lift this to a level of abstraction. So really seeing like more of these spaces in terms of, and I work a lot with Black working class communities. I come from Black working class background as well. And so thinking about how what we're teaching in the academy has to get to our community and our folks on the ground that are on the forefront. And not to say that we're not, but on the forefront of a lot of these battles in terms of trying to create a world that is life affirming for us. So what are the ways in which we do that within the spaces that we are in the academy? How do we actually make those linkages between the academic spaces and the institutions, and really think very seriously, not sort of like these sort of in terms of rhetoric, but really think seriously, what does it mean for decolonization to be an actual reality? Because it's a process that has been arrested in so many different ways. The ways in which we're thinking about the world that we're living in and our systems and structures, they're a faulty design. And we have to think about what our world is going to look like beyond struggle. Like, what are we fighting for? So ways that we can institutionalize that, that's how I'm thinking about that. And I'm open to, more of a kind of robust conversation. I want to also give time for folks that, have questions and comments that they want to share.
Yeah, thank you so much. We actually only have about 2 more minutes left for this panel. Of course, I knew this would happen. We had a couple comments in the chat. You addressed the question about Islam and anti-Blackness, and Professor Abdul Khabeer also put some articles in the chat. So I wanted to also just highlight, there was another question about thinking about issues of colorism within the Muslim community, in relation to Blackness, anti-Blackness. I think thinking about light skin, dark skin, the commenter asked. And then also a question about American Muslim philanthropy, which I think is an interesting question in regards to thinking about the something to do, what you were just saying, Tasneem, about the interactions between the academy and the quote unquote community, and how such conversations around Islam and Blackness and race and racialization and security and surveillance and all of these things really have never just been academic conversations. These are conversations that are going on in real time to communities who are dealing with these issues in their everyday lives on both micro and macro levels. And so I guess I'm so sorry we probably don't have time to really address those questions, but I think the content of those questions really reflects the ways in which these issues are kind of, touching people's lives on an everyday everyday way in which people are literally asking, what do we do? And so I hope, inshallah, that conversations like this are ones that we will have for many years to come. And I want to end by thanking all of our panelists and saying that it is my hope and prayer that this conversation is actually the beginning of a larger working group that we are starting here at Rutgers around this very issue of Islam, Muslims, Blackness, and anti-Blackness that I hope to continue. So thank you so much to Dr. Siddiqui, Abdul Khabeer, and Graywall for their wonderful and rich contributions. And I do hope that we can continue this conversation in a myriad of forms in the days and months and years to come. Thank you so much. And thank you so much to all of you for joining us. We are going to take a 10-minute break right now, and then we are going to return for the next panel. And I hope our wonderful panelists can stay for that as well, though I completely understand if you cannot. It's a second week of teaching. All right, thank you everyone, and take good care in these difficult times.